Hello and welcome to episode 31 of the 1001 Movies podcast, the podcast based on the book 1001 Movies You Must See Before You Die. Each episode we randomly choose and discuss one of the films from the book. This time we'll be talking about Sergio Leone's classic 1966 spaghetti western, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly.
I've been looking for you for 8 months. Whenever I should have had a gun in my right hand, I thought of you. Now I find you in exactly the position that suits me. I had lots of time to learn how to shoot with my left.
When you have to shoot, don't talk.
There's no denying, whether you're a fan of the genre or not, that westerns are kitschy. They are the epitome of Americana and live within a niche that's either respected by their longtime fans or criticized and largely ignored by those who aren't. By the 1960s, westerns in America were quickly joining monster movies as a has-been form of art. Whereas in Europe, there were over 70 Spanish or Italian filmmakers making low-budget spaghetti westerns. Sergio Leone wanted to go beyond the low budgets and simple plots that his contemporaries were churning at and make something truly epic. As the son of a filmmaker, Sergio Leone was practically born into the business. After World War II, Europe was flooded with American films, and Leone preferred America's sensationalism to the French New Wave or Italian neorealism. He was also a fan of pulp detective fiction and, of course, westerns. In the 1950s, he worked as an assistant director on dozens of features, but it wasn't until 1964, with A Fistful of Dollars starring Clint Eastwood, that Leone made his mark. He followed it up the next year with a sequel for a few dollars more. Both films were distributed almost exclusively in Europe, but when Leone's co-writer Luciano Vincenzoni took some United Artists executives to see For a Few Dollars More in an Italian cinema, they immediately asked to buy the rights to distribute both it and its prequel in America. When they asked Vincenzoni what he and Leone planned for their next film, he spluttered something about 3 men and a treasure hunt. Instantly, he had sold the idea for The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. The film's premise is simple enough. 3 men, Blondie, the titular good character, played by Clint Eastwood, Angel Eyes, the bad guy, played by Lee Van Cleef, and Tuco, the ugly one of the piece, portrayed by Eli Wallach, are searching for a cache of gold against the backdrop of Confederate General Sibley's ill-fated march through New Mexico during the Civil War. The gold is buried in a grave in an overcrowded cemetery, and while Angel Eyes and Tuco know where the cemetery is, Blondie alone knows the name on the grave. What follows is a game of treachery and double-crossing, culminating in a showdown among all 3 of them after the gold is dug up. Clint Eastwood, who had worked with Leone on A Fistful of Dollars and For a Few Dollars More, was a shoo-in for the role of Blondie, and the intention was that this film was to be the third in a trilogy, although the man with no name is actually given a name this time. Lee Van Cleef had already established himself as a villain in a number of other westerns, including For a Few Dollars More, although his star seemed to be fading. He was getting older, the roles were becoming fewer and far between, and an injury in his leg resulted in a visible limp. Leone's casting of him revitalized Van Cleef's career, and he would go on to play in westerns and action movies until his death in 1989. Eli Wallach was a wild card. humorous and grotesque, Tuco was unlike any other character Leone had ever written. He had seen Wallach cast as a villain in How the West Was Won and knew that he would be perfect for the role. Spanning about 3 hours long, the rather simple plot of the film belies the sheer epic quality of Leone's filmmaking. The film opens with a dusty landscape of a ghost town, and immediately is replaced with a close-up of a man's squinting face. Close-ups and landscapes became Leone's trademark throughout the film. He knew that the plot, at its simplest level, was a thing of the pulp westerns he had read growing up, but he wanted to add his own distinct stamp to it. While his contemporaries were making films in which the action was short and fast, Leone let the story linger on his characters before a gunfight, whether it be silently in the opening scene or with a rambling preamble, such as when Tuco shoots an old nemesis while taking a bath. The cemetery standoff near the conclusion is exemplary of Leone's penchant for long and drawn-out close-ups, with the suspenseful standoff among the three title characters. Had he been less interested in making art as opposed to a story, most of this would have been cut, and we would have perhaps been treated to a quick shootout, followed by agonizing slow-motion shots of the victims falling to the ground, guns ablazing. Ennio Morricone's brilliant score added to the tension of this scene, as well as most of those before it. Morricone created 3 different versions of the theme tune, each dedicated to one of the 3 characters, and these are strategically placed throughout the film. The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly was probably the film that put Morricone on the map, and out of everyone involved, his career arguably profited the most. To date, IMDb credits him for scoring 528 films or television shows. While Leone should obviously be lauded for his directing, some credit should go to the screenwriters as well. As mentioned earlier, these men's quest for gold is set against the backdrop of the American Civil War, one of the bloodiest times in this country's history. There are moments when the action of the 3 main characters takes a break to focus on the bloody tribulations of Union and Confederate soldiers alike, and it becomes obvious that the motives of these 3 greedy men are made minuscule by the terrible acts going on around them. 1862 was a particularly rough time for the Confederates when General Sibley attempted to march his men across New Mexico. The campaign was a crashing failure, costing many lives. Near the end of the film, Blondie and Tuco encounter a drunken Union captain whose job is to protect a nearby bridge from destruction. The captain, unconcerned with his superior's motives for keeping the bridge intact, or why the enemy may feel the same way, is simply resigned to the fact that soldiers are pawns in a bigger game, and the best thing to do is get drunk. Whether they had realized it or not, the screenwriters had perhaps hit upon a nerve with American audiences, many for which the Vietnam War would be received with the same kind of apathy. When The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly was released in America in 1968, the trailer erroneously confused Tuco as the bad character and Angel Eyes as the ugly one. The irony here is that all 3 title characters go outside the lines of their predefined archetypes, which are set up in the film's 30-minute prologue. Blondie is hardly good. He cons townspeople out of their money, and his treatment of Tuco in the closing scene is slightly less than honorable. Tuco, the ugly one of the piece, does indeed double-cross and kill others to get what he needs to survive, but he's the only one at the end who seems willing to fulfill his end of the bargain. Finally, even the bad Angel Eyes has a moment or two when he encounters a platoon of battered soldiers. He displays an empathy that is rarely shown. Several cuts were made of the film, most of which were to the detriment to the story. The American cut deleted the grotto scene, which introduced 3 minor characters whose appearance in the next scene had never been previously explained. A number of other scenes were cut, but the entire 3-hour version can currently be found on Blu Ray in all of its well-deserved glory. Everyone involved with the production went on to success. Leone would go on to make such masterpieces as 1968's Once Upon a Time in the West and 1984's Once Upon a Time in America, both of which are listed in the book that inspired this podcast and are subjects for another episode. I've already talked about Ennio Morricone and Lee Van Cleef, and Eli Wallach would go on to act in a number of films and television shows, perhaps most notably the maligned, but nevertheless entertaining, The Godfather Part 3. He died in 2014 at the ripe old age of 98. Clint Eastwood, as I talked about in episode 23 of this podcast, will go on to co-found the Malpaso production company, and his success from then on hardly needs to be retold here. What did I think of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly? Back in episode 23, I went on about how I don't quite get Westerns, and perhaps I wasn't the best person suited to talk about them. In case you haven't been listening for the past few minutes, nothing could be farther from the truth with this film. I've seen it 3 times now, and it continues to hypnotize me. Although the direction and camera work are obviously worthy of note, the film has a hypnotic quality to me, such as the scene in the beginning where Angel Eyes meets his first victim of the piece. They sit at a table talking and eating soup, and it's as though every single second counts. The gritty surroundings, the sound of the soup being slurped by the 2 men, the slow banter between them, everything is so deliberate. I admit I'm hardly the person to judge, but this is probably the best Western I've ever seen. Hell, it's probably one of the top 20 films I've ever seen. If you haven't seen it, I hope that this inspires you to watch it now. That's all I had to say about The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Tune in next time when we talk about the 1965 Belgian film The Man Who Had His Hair Cut Short, directed by André Delvaux. In the meantime, feel free to email any questions or comments to 1001moviespodcast@gmail.com, like the podcast on Facebook, and follow me on Twitter at 1001moviespc. Until next time, happy viewing.